Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. As I'm sure that someone somewhere has said before, I'm Rob O'Connor, editor here at Infrastructure Intelligence, and welcome to the latest in our series of Infrastructure Intelligence live events, which, as ever, has been organised in association with our events and communications strategic partner, BECG. Happy to say we have another typically fantastic panel of industry experts here with us this morning, all giving us their views on an increasingly important question, namely, should house building be part of infrastructure, and if so, why? So, building new homes will be at the forefront of the UK's ongoing recovery from the COVID pandemic, and the housing sector remains crucial to the government's levelling up ambitions. The stated aim to build 300,000 new homes every year by the mid-2020s will only be met by building at scale, including major new villages, towns and suburbs across the UK. So for development to happen at this level and to create sustainable places, some suggest that policy has to change so that housing can be classed as infrastructure in the planning process. Bringing housing under the National Infrastructure Brief could pave the way for more affordable, high-quality developments, which are supported by both the right infrastructure and local communities, which results in sustainable places that work for everyone. A policy that prioritises housing alongside transport, broadband, energy and water would enable planning applications for larger housing developments to go through the nationally significant infrastructure project process, so they would be considered at a national level. But is that going to happen, or is localism going to get in the way? Before I introduce our first speaker this morning, can I just remind everyone watching that you're very welcome to ask any questions in the chat button, and we'll try and address your points as we go along. But first, what does our panel think? Our first speaker today, Snigdha Jain, is a sustainability and ESG director at Turley, and she has more than 15 years experience providing strategic advice across new developments and existing asset portfolios. She has supported the integration of sustainability within various garden villages and major infrastructure projects across the UK, from the inception through to completion stages. Turley is a full service employee-owned national planning and development consultancy, and Turley's planning expertise specialises in economics, design, and EIA. Have helped the clients achieve good growth in major cities and growth areas. So Snigdha is perfectly placed to offer us their expert insight today, and we're delighted to welcome her to the table. So Snigdha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you for the invite and the opportunity to be able to contribute to this debate on essentially what I think is an idea that has the potential to tackle our chronic affordable housing shortage. The premise of the idea is very interesting for me. It's a joined up approach to housing and infrastructure. And as a sustainability professional, I can definitely see the immense possibilities this would unlock. So with infrastructure and housing coming together, we can start from the onset through careful site selection, creating places where good transport connectivity is inherent. We'd have this interconnectedness of live, work, and play spaces, which would create these thriving, walkable neighborhoods. They'd be strong social infrastructure in the form of healthcare and green spaces in place prior to residents moving in, thus safeguarding their physical and mental well-being. And crucially, there would be an opportunity for innovation around energy, powered by clean technologies and deploying smart energy management, lowering or eliminating fuel bills, which is more important now than ever when we're facing a cost of living crisis. However, there are just some considerations and challenges that would need to be worked through with these ideas coming together. So as an example, infrastructure does have longer build times. It needs a larger outlay of capital, and it has a longer return of investment. What we wouldn't want as unintended consequences is delays to delivery or greater uncertainty around funding. So conclude, I'd just like to say there is just a lot of talk around infrastructure and housing being these two halves needing to be made into a whole. So the question is really, how do we get this idea, which is all around positive planning, and layer it with more of a long-term financial and stewardship so that it becomes our glue. And I'm looking forward to hearing what the rest of my panelists think about that. Back to you, Rob.
There you go. It's always great when you put yourself on mute and you don't realize you've done it, but there you go. Thanks very much for that, Stig. There's some fantastic points there about making sure the right infrastructure is in place when new developments are taking place, especially around healthcare and infrastructure, and the fact that, you know, infrastructure and housing, two halves that should be part of the same whole sort of thing. Very good thought-provoking stuff there. And our next speaker, which I'm sure could add to that, is Paul Smith. Is the managing director of the Strategic Land Group, not just a strategic land group, the Strategic Land Group, and they are a specialist land promotion company operating across England with a focus on housing and renewable energy projects. Now, a chartered town planner, Paul has held director level roles at a PLC house builder and a national planning consultancy, both which give him a well-rounded view of the challenges of delivering new homes. He writes for a number of industry publications, and he was actually approached by government for input into the emerging planning reforms. So, ideally placed to offer his unique insight. Paul, welcome to the discussion, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rob, and good morning, everybody. I thought this was a really interesting question. Is housing infrastructure? And I think to answer it, we've got to travel back in time to the dim and distant past, and we're all experts on the ancient history of cities. Now we've read the Levelling Up white paper and the handy sort of timeline it provided. And the reason that cities have been such a successful form for humans to live in throughout history is because of the power of agglomeration. And what essentially that means is that if you've got lots of people in the same place, you can increase your specialization with the work that you do. You can become increasingly specialized. You can become more efficient at what you do because you're more specialized. And that then in turn drives economic growth. And that raises living standards, encourages more people to move to those towns and cities. And how do you increase the size of that? So the size of the labor pool is really key to how successful cities can be. And roughly today, that means the number of people that can access a job within about an hour from an hour travel time from their home. And there's a couple of ways, therefore, you can increase the size of that labor pool in any one area. And the first is you can improve transport links, roads, trams, rail, cycle lanes, whatever it is. You can improve transport links, improve transport infrastructure, to use that word, and you increase the size of the labor pool. But there's another way you can do it as well, and that's actually to build more homes. And if you have more housing of all sorts of different forms closer to towns and cities, then that also increases the size of the labor pool. So to that extent, it clearly is infrastructure. Now, Rob mentioned that we've got this target. The government has its target to build 300,000 homes a year by the date keeps rolling back when they're going to do that. And we're not really anywhere close to that. And there's no mystery to why we're so far away from it. We're not planning to build that number of homes. So if you add up the housing targets in every single local plan in England, they total somewhere around 190,000. Now, we can't wish homes into existence. You've actually got to plan to deliver them in the first place. And that isn't to say that there aren't some significant sort of systemic improvements that we can make. We can certainly streamline the planning process. We can make it more responsive to changing conditions. And one of the most important examples, actually, of how we can improve it is this huge disconnect between land use and transport planning that Snigdha alluded to. That we have land use planning and transport planning carried out by different bodies on different scales, over different geographies and over different time scales, and they're doing it at a different time. So it's really difficult to get the two to dovetail together, but we should be looking at how land use planning, transport planning, and even economic growth strategies, how they all fit together. So That being the case, actually extending the NSIP regime over housing sites won't really fix any of that. It will probably just add a bit more complexity into what we're trying to do. You know, it may well have a place on very large scale settlements, new settlements perhaps, that are trying to meet housing need at a greater than local authority area. But new settlements like that are rare and are only ever going to make a relatively modest contribution to the number of new homes. So the bigger win is actually enabling the planning system to better deliver increased housing densities in urban areas, which means making the system more predictable for everybody, for developers as well as for local residents. And most fundamentally of all, you know, planning for the right number of homes in the first place. So that's, I suppose that's my starting point. And yeah, back to you, Rob.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Paul. Great comments as ever, especially the fact that we can't wish new homes in existence and we actually have to plan for them. And that means that the right planning system needs to be in place. Moving on to our next speaker. Happy to introduce, let's have a look. We got Robbie Owen, he's a partner of Pinsent Masons and leads their UK infrastructure planning and government affairs business. Now, as we all know, Pinsent Masons is a full-service international law firm headquartered in London. The firm provides a network of 27 locations across the globe in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia Pacific. Robbie himself has 35 years experience of advising on the planning and consenting of a wide variety of nationally significant and major transport and other infrastructure projects in the UK, and also on infrastructure and public policy and parliamentary issues. Much of Robbie's caseload now involves taking projects through the nationally significant infrastructure projects planning regime established by the Planning Act in 2008, giving advice on a wide range of planning, highways, environmental, compulsory acquisition, and other aspects of public and administrative law. Robbie is also the founder, director, and secretary of the National Infrastructure Planning Association. I don't believe he's got 35 years experience. He just doesn't look old enough as far as I'm concerned. So basically, Robbie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rob. And sadly, I am that old. Yeah, well, as you've heard, I've been working with the Planning Act of 2008 since the very beginning, and the way it provides for an effective way of giving permission for what we call NSIPs, nationally significant infrastructure projects. And it's been continuously reformed over the years since it was created, and the government at the moment, through the National Infrastructure Strategy and Project Speed, is well embarked on a further program of reform to improve the system even further. It's consented over 100 transport, energy, water and waste projects since it started operating in 2010, and has done very well. And this issue of whether housing should be able to, large-scale housing should be able to use the NSIPs regime is not a new one. There's been a lot of debate about this, I would say, since around 2015, possibly even earlier than that. And I really do think that the time has come when government should, through a fairly straightforward provision that could be added to the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, which of course is now before Parliament as being the key vehicle for the government's planning reforms, a fairly straightforward amendment that would allow major housing, and this isn't just greenfield sites, but also major urban extensions, to use the regime in certain cases as being a very, I mean, DCOs, so development consent orders is what you get at the end of the process for a nationally significant infrastructure project, and they are the single most powerful delivery tool there is available in planning, and they're extremely effective in that respect. And I would see that government allowing major housing to go down this particular planning and consenting route, so allowing, not requiring, not making it compulsory, would be a very effective part of the levelling up agenda, and very much also responding to the government's brownfield emphasis. So I think this is a change that should be done, could fairly easily be done, wouldn't require a national policy statement, for example, that for those of you aware of the NSIPS regime for infrastructure projects, there is a series of national policy statements in place. And I think that this could be seen as a very effective way of enabling local plan delivery. It can be presented, I think, not as sort of going against local authority wishes, but you can have a sort of entry gate system where the local authority agreed to, in any one instance, using the NSIPS regime, where the developer thinks that's the best way of implementing these large projects, where very often they're taking 20, 25 years to come to fruition, which is frankly too long. We can't wait that long now, given the need to deliver many more housing units than we have been in recent years. So I think it could be a very effective additional tool, not suitable, as Paul said, in some cases at all, and not to be compulsory, but I think it would be a very useful additional tool for delivering these large-scale complex sites involving dealing with third-party land interests, large transport issues, other issues to do with utilities, railways, all these things that just are very complicated having to deliver under conventional town and country planning, whereas under a DCO you can do all of these things under one roof. So Rob, that's all I would like to say in opening, and back to you.
Right. Well, thanks very much for that, Robbie. Some fantastic points there on the need for speeding the process up and concentrating on it's a change that coding should be done, vital to help with the levelling up agenda as well. And basically some great points there. And looking at just getting set to introduce our final speaker for the morning. Daniel Fritt is an associate director at Becg, the specialist communications consultancy for the built environment. Now, Becg, if you didn't know already, sure you do. It's won an array of awards over recent years for its fantastic campaigns and effective stakeholder engagement in support of housing, infrastructure, energy, transport, and logistics. And they are actually ranked #1 for public affairs in the recent PR Week 2022 awards. PR Week, of course, being the PR Bible for the PR industry. Now, Daniel, in the previous life, he worked as a press officer to former Housing Minister Gavin Barwell, and prior to that, worked in local government. So he's very well placed to give us an inside and expert view this morning. So, Daniel, welcome to the table, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Rob, and thanks for the very kind introduction. Yeah, I was just going to pick up on the same point that Paul made as an initial introduction. If we're thinking about housing and infrastructure, thanks to Michael Gove, we all know about the history of Mesopotamia and Jericho now, don't we? And the first houses and the cradle of civilization. But in many ways, housing is the original infrastructure, isn't it? There were houses long before there were roads and aqueducts. It is the most essential piece of infrastructure that we can have as a civilization. And I think we've sort of moved away from that in terms of our thinking, certainly as a nation in previous years. In the sort of post-war era, it's easy to lose sight of that. And you speak to people, anyone who's been at a community consultation, anyone that's spoken to district councillors in marginal wards, in Greenbelt, will hear the phrase, we do not need homes here. We simply do not need new homes. There is no demand for it. The government is trying to enforce artificially high numbers. We don't need it. So I think there's still a fundamental disconnection between government targets and what the housing industry and us as the planning world believe is necessary, and what the general public believe on a day-to-day basis is needed in the country. So I think that's for a couple of reasons. So I think we've got two sort of issues that we need to solve if we're going to sensibly think about housing as infrastructure, which, as everyone has said this afternoon, there's definitely merit in. There's the political issues. As you said, Rob, I worked for Gavin Barwell in 2016, so it's only 6 years ago. There's been 7 housing ministers since then. And these figures get thrown around. It's easy to be desensitized to them, but it has a massive effect, doesn't it? If you have someone who is heading up the housing world in this country, and that person is changing every year, it's very difficult to have long-term thinking, long-term strategic planning and reforms in that area. If you combine that with the fact that only 3%, according to Chris Pincher, 3% of people are involved in local plan making, then you have a disengaged public and you have a rapidly changing leadership in this area. So it's really no surprise that it needs reform for me. There's also the fact that there's local elections 3 out of 4 years in lots of places. There is very little political appetite to be able to take ambitious decisions on new housing when there's elections around the corner. And equally, as some of my fellow panelists have said, and they will understand the intricacies of the planning system better than I do, but there is a fundamental issue there. And if you look at somewhere like North Essex Garden Communities, here was an ambitious, really ambitious proposal for the largest garden community in the country, which had support from 3 different local authorities. They weren't all necessarily the same political persuasion either. One was a rainbow coalition. So it's quite rare that you get that, but yet it fell down. And it fell down for a few reasons, but partly because they had to demonstrate up to 40 years of soundness and deliverability on a project across three local authority areas, which is very, very difficult to do. So I suggest there does need to be reform in thinking about how those large strategic sites can be delivered. So as Robbie said earlier, DCOs are one of the single most powerful tools to be able to make that happen. So I would agree that there are benefits to applying development consent order principles and thinking of some of these large new settlements as nationally significant infrastructure projects, having them considered at a national level, whether that's the same DCO process that we have for power stations and large transport infrastructure is up for discussion. But I definitely think that there's merit in doing that. And the one thing I would say, Rob, just to sort of conclude, is that whatever the process that we choose is, I think it's critical to take communities along with us on the journey. There's lots of new methods to do that. And one of the things I'd really like to see is that we drive up that number from 3% of people, which is a woefully low number, isn't it, that have any idea or any involvement in local plans. And I think we'll see the system improving and driving forwards if we can take communities on the journey. So thanks, Rob. Back to you.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Daniel. Some great points there about housing. Obviously, you know, it doesn't seem like rocket science to me that housing is the original infrastructure. But it does seem to be playing second fiddle in a lot of ways to most other infrastructure. And the point at the end about we need to encourage greater involvement at community level and bring communities along, get them on side with decisions that are being made. And that is, again, it's a vital point, and so forth. So just looking at now, so we got a few questions that have been raised from today, I think, and I'm looking at I'm thinking that building potentially millions of new homes over the coming decades would obviously put more pressure on local authorities and house builders to work together to provide better supporting infrastructure, whether that's roads, public transport, schools, water, broadband, EV charging points, etc. How would that be coordinated? And I think I'm going to ask Robbie first one on that.
Sorry, Rob, coordination in what respect?
Well, how do you get sort of, you know, like housing developers and local authorities to work together more to make sure that infrastructure is, you know, sort of put in place and is better coordinated?
Well, certainly, if you're talking about the 2008 Act DCO planning regime, that has a very strong emphasis on really thorough engagement with all interested parties. So, including engagement between the developer or the applicant on the one hand and all affected local authorities, and it's really robustly policed by the planning inspectorate. And there's a very big emphasis on consultation as well as engagement, and of course the two are very different. And actually, that therefore ensures that all of those with an interest in the particular infrastructure scheme concerned, and the same would be so of housing if this were allowed to be dealt with under the regime, are all really heavily engaged in and consulted on the project concerned well before an application lands. And you mentioned, I think Daniel mentioned the imperative of involving communities. What I've just said applies to them equally. And actually, when a proposed development consent order goes through the examination process, once it's been applied for under the 2008 Act, it goes through basically, it's the equivalent of a 6-month sort of virtual and physical mixed together public inquiry, where you're having this examination of the proposal over a maximum of 6 months. Everyone's entitled to participate, and it's very, very inclusive, far more inclusive, I would argue, and far more effective in that respect than a local authority-led planning process. And you just need to, for anyone who's participated in a DCO examination, I think you'll recognise what I'm saying in terms of it being open to all. And you're absolutely right, involving communities in particular is critical. So I would say, Rob, that the answer to your question is the framework of the 2008 Act regime and all of the guidance and advice notes that go with it, it ensures that degree of coordination and collaboration on top of course, the local plan process, which under the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, government is legislating to improve. And I think the improvements will be worthwhile.
Right, thanks for that, Robbie. Paul, would you have any sort of thoughts on the coordination between, or increased collaboration between local authorities and housing developers?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key to all of this is actually to plan. And I know that sounds sort of slightly glib, but we only have about half of the local authorities in England with an up-to-date local plan as things stand. And we're in a position where when it comes to planning, local authorities are often firefighting. And I mean that in two respects. One is that they're simply massively under-resourced. Planning departments have seen some of the biggest funding cuts of any section of local government over the last sort of decade or so, which is saying something. But also firefighting in that they're often quite late in doing things because of some of those political pressures that Daniel mentioned before. You know, there are very few votes in new homes. It would seem. So local authorities often delay work on local plans until they absolutely have to do it because the current one is about to run out, and there'll be what they see as negative consequences if they don't. And because it's so late, the developments are starting sort of before the plan is in place, and you start to get this disconnect then between the homes being built and what other organisations plan to deliver around it. And a good example of that is utility providers and sewerage. Not a particularly sexy thing to talk about, but water companies are supposed to look at a local plan, see how many new homes are planned to be delivered in different areas across that 15-year period, and upgrade their sewage works accordingly. That's their statutory responsibility. Now, it's very difficult for them to do that when there isn't a plan in place and they don't have that long-term vision, so that they know what they need to do. So I think having that plan in place becomes key, because then lots of all the people that have got to deliver all this other infrastructure can see over a 10 or 15-year time horizon exactly what is going to be needed where. I think where we could make a big improvement though, and I alluded to this at the start, is we have this weird separation between land use and transport planning, and it's really odd. You know, when you play SimCity on your computer, you don't just build the buildings and then have another computer game that you play to deliver the transport infrastructure and hope that the two match up. You sit down and you think about the two together. Where are we going to put the roads? Where are we going to put the railway lines? What does that mean for what development we can deliver around it? And we have, like I said, different bodies doing that planning, looking at different geographies, at different timescales, with actually different degrees of responsibility. You know, I'm sat in our Manchester our office in Manchester, or if you're from Manchester, technically I'm over the river in Salford. And when you look at the great planning, the great work at planning the transport infrastructure that was put into by Transport for the North, coming up with the Northern Powerhouse Rail Scheme, and it's just all been junked. And it's very difficult for local authorities to say, well, actually, we can deliver more homes in this location because we know that there's going to be transport improvements there. Or to say, well, how about, can we have a new tram stop here because that's a really good site for delivering homes because it ticks all these other boxes. It's very hard. You know, we do need to do better at integrating that. And if you want to be really revolutionary about it, it probably means merging the Department for Transport with DLUC or whatever it's called this week.
That would be quite a radical thing. Imagine that, another name for the housing department, housing department. Sorry, at the government. Stinker, what would your thoughts be on trying to make sure that local authorities and housing development can work better together?
I think the example I'd probably like to bring to the table is that you know, we've seen in the climate emergency how we've managed to come together. All local authorities declared a climate emergency. We're moving at pace to kind of having a uniform set of criteria to measure, map, monitor, reduce, and achieve our net zero targets. So I think it's a fantastic example of how will can kind of almost trump that, even though local plans are at different levels of maturity, different stages. Despite that, all local authorities have managed to come together. So I believe it can be done. We're increasingly moving towards, I think the question was, how can we integrate all these different things? We're increasingly moving towards, away from greenwashing towards a uniform set of KPIs that I think that can be, brought together quite easily in delivery of housing and infrastructure, because they're both working towards the same metrics now.
Yeah, good points. Daniel, how would you say that house builders and local authorities could work better together without risking the clash of localism getting in the way of a bigger picture, shall we say?
Yeah, I think there are good local authorities and there are some not so good local authorities, aren't there? And
No.
there are, being diplomatic, some have local plan delivery boards where you have councillors considering the local plan next steps and publicly considering sites and their merits and discussing that and taking that forwards. And some have dedicated officers. So Waltham Forest, North East London has a dedicated officer who liaises with developers, and they have a local plan which has been agreed, and that seems to work very well. You have an early stage, you have discussions between developers and the local authority about where to allocate growth, how to do that, and it's not sort of a last minute discussion and things taken to planning committee and the committee don't really feel as if they've had sight of it or officers have helped shape it. So I think there is more that local authorities can do to facilitate some of those roles and make the process easier. Having said that, as Paul says, they're sort of criminally under-resourced, aren't they, in lots of areas. So I believe that the planning bill is looking at adjusting that and increasing the fees around planning applications, but others will know more about that. I also think that some local authorities that I've spoken to are happy for a application to be taken at DCO level, because it takes it out of their hands in lots of respects. So you don't have the sort of political toxicity of having to deal with a 1,000 home development on your borders, and it's a decision for the government to take and for you to feed into. So it removes some of that and makes things slightly easier to deal with. So I do think that there's more that we can do to, from a central government point of view, to help those conversations and not make it quite so combative.
Yeah, good points, good points. Changing tack pretty much completely here, I think. Question for everyone across the board. But I'll come to you first, Paul. Now, if the ambitious house building targets are to be met, which you mentioned earlier, should modern methods of construction, modular housing and stuff, be an integral part of any new sort of developments and new housing developments, just to make sure that those targets can be met?
It's an interesting question. I would, first of all, it's an interesting choice of words, the ambitious housing targets. I'm not sure they are that ambitious. If you look at France, I think we are still allowed to compare ourselves to European countries, but if you look at France, their housing target, it's economically very similar to us. It's similar sort of population, albeit it's a bit bigger. But they have a housing target of 400,000 homes per year.
Mm-hmm. I think when I said ambitious, I was trying to be diplomatic there.
and they're delivering it. And if we had the number of homes per capita in England that they have in France, we would have 25% more homes, right? And that's not a question of space and that France is bigger, because it's only about 8% of England that's actually developed. So, you know, the 300,000 homes a year target is probably quite unambitious. In terms of, you know, the role that MMC has to play, I'm sort of agnostic about how we actually go and build the homes. It's sort of, you know, if we're building more, yes, you know, it is more likely, I suspect, that you'll see more developers using modern methods of construction. I'm actually sat just behind my camera. I'm sat looking at one of Urban Splash's modular housing schemes and a half-built modular apartment scheme that they were involved in. You know, so if you're trying to deliver more homes, probably because of issues to do with labour shortages and material shortages, you will end up using MMC. But that doesn't matter per se for delivering the target. It isn't the way we build homes isn't the reason that we're not building enough of them. You know, so yes, it might have some benefits, but it's not critical, I don't think. And you know, ultimately developers will find a way, because one of the things they're very good at is finding ways to build the homes that that they've got permission for as quickly as the market will absorb them.
Yeah, some good points there. Daniel, if I can come to you with the experience of working for a housing minister, would you think that basically, well, one thing that Paul mentioned there was the targets and is not as ambitious as they possibly should be in terms of like the numbers of houses getting built. And we know that there's lots of people on like social housing waiting lists, council waiting lists, over 1 million, I think, at the last count. Would you say that you know, a local authority is pushing hard enough to ensure more local housing as part of the housing solution? And from your experience of working in government, is that will? Is there a will there to sort of make sure that social housing plays a much bigger part in the agenda for getting houses built that people actually need?
Well, just on that first one, Rob, on MMC, I mean, so Sajid Javid was the Secretary of State when I was there, and that was a massive drive for him at the time. There was lots of talk of MMC and could this be a new frontier for Britain and a new industry that we could really branch out into? There's much less talk of it now, I feel, or certainly it doesn't take quite the forefront that it used to in government rhetoric. So, you know, I wonder if that's cooled off a little bit, but, you know, certainly I think we have to look at whatever innovative methods we can do to help deliver houses, as long as that, you know, meets quality criterion, as long as they are, you know, pleasant places to live, which are in keeping with local areas. On the social housing side, again, I think there are good authorities who have really got a handle on house building and on set targets for meeting affordable housing figures. So, obviously in London, it's a slightly different story, and most authorities will look for 40% across the board, given London targets and the Mayor of London's ambitions. And others have taken it into their own hands to borrow what are some of the best rates for borrowing money that anyone will get, and that's for local authorities, and actually taking a step forward and looking to drive these themselves. I mean, some areas don't particularly want to be social landlords and want to, someone else to manage that on their behalf. The housing associations do a very good job of that. But I think we are seeing a few local authorities branch out now and taking a real step forwards in trying to meet those affordable targets, which I think needs to happen.
Thanks for that. Stigner, what were your thoughts on that, MMC and the role to sort of get more new, get houses built at speed, but good houses as well?
Yeah, I think affordability and I think sustainability have just never been mutually exclusive concepts for me. So I think that just can be done at the same time. So MMC, yes, absolutely, can be one of many innovations that we can use, not only to speed up the process as been suggested. Of course, it can be done. You can design, assemble, deploy more efficiently, which is the purpose behind MMC. But you can also have the potential to kind of integrate it with sort of the carbon challenges we're facing. So that's the other advantage of it for me, that it gives you an opportunity to optimize sort of the carbon performance and then deploy at scale. But yeah, I think it's one of many opportunities we now have in the innovative space around materials that we can look to kind of move forward with. I think you're mute.
So, leading into that, on your thoughts on carbon and net zero, question for you, Robbie. There's a question in chat from Ian Parker. Hi. Does new housing developments have a specific focus in helping the UK to reach its net zero targets? And if not, why not? What do you think, Robbie?
Well, yeah, this is clearly key part of the government's agenda, and we are seeing with the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill that a government is wanting to put in place a new system for national development management policies that will be sitting alongside the National Planning Policy Framework. Indeed, the NPPF will become part of this sort of suite of national development management policies that government are wanting to be taken into account as material considerations equally to local plans when it comes to deciding on planning applications. And if there's a conflict between a national policy and a local plan policy, then the national policy trumps the local plan policy. And it's through strong national policy that you can, I think, achieve the right contribution to the net zero agenda by the housing sector, and to make sure that you have a uniform requirement across the country rather than different local plans having different requirements in this respect, which I would think is not desirable. So I'm not an expert in terms of housing and net zero, but certainly in terms of mechanisms, government is absolutely seized on the need for that. And indeed, if the 2008 Act DCO regime was opened up to allow major housing as well, because currently it is prohibited, then the whole architecture of the 2008 Act NSIPS planning regime would equally allow net zero considerations, as they currently are absolutely critical when it comes to deciding on infrastructure schemes. It would allow net zero considerations to be equally taken into account in deciding whether a particular large-scale housing scheme should be allowed to proceed as a DCO and be given a DCO.
Thanks for that, Robbie. Paul, What do you think? What are your thoughts on that? Does new housing development have a specific focus in helping the UK to reach its net zero targets at the minute? And if not, why not?
I mean, it definitely does. And, Robbie alluded to some of the government's, some of the changes the government's introducing to look at the built fabric of new homes and to make them more energy efficient. And we're seeing changes coming down the track, like gas central heating being banned. So new homes will all have air source heat pumps actually pretty soon. And national policy is key to all those sorts of things because it drives consistency, and it's that consistency between local authorities that what you will have to do regardless of where you are in the country that increases volume and therefore cost effectiveness and efficiency of some of these measures, which then in turn can help them spread out into the second-hand market, which, let's face it, is where the vast majority of our new homes are, or of our homes are. But it isn't just about the built fabric of the homes. Achieving net zero is also about where we build the homes in the first place and the location of them. And we know, for instance, that residents of cities have a lower carbon footprint than those that live in more rural areas because they're less dependent on the car, for instance. And we're pretty bad at increasing density. There's a great piece of research by Centre for Cities called Sleepy Suburbs. I'll put a link to it in the comments. And that points out that over the last decade, half of all of our suburbs delivered an average of 1 new home per year. That's just horrendous in terms of trying to increase density. It's one of the reasons why we have pretty much the oldest housing stock in Europe. So we need to look at how we can improve urban densities, and some of that, and I mentioned it at the outset, is about the predictability of the planning system, developers knowing that they can deliver a 3 or 4 story apartment block next door to those 2-story detached houses, and that they're very, very likely to get planning permission for it, all other things being equal, and it won't get derailed by public opposition and just the weight of letters being written to local councils. But it also, there's another actually really unpalatable choice politically that we need to look at, and that is, and we've not said it much today, but that is the green belt. All discussions on housing ultimately come back to the green belt. It does prevent cities growing outwards, and one of the unintended consequences of that is homes leapfrog it, and that increases commutes. There's some really good academic research on this that shows that the existence of the green belt increases average commuting distances, and because a lot of that commuting, especially outside of London and the southeast, is done in cars. And yes, okay, we might be moving to electric cars, but they are not the answer to net zero. They're just shifting the source of the pollution often to other countries, where some of the raw materials to make the batteries and things are being extracted in the first place. So yes, the planning system is doing things about net zero. Yes, it can do more, but it needs to look at the location of homes as well as the fabric and the way they're specifically constructed.
Okay, thanks for that, Paul. Daniel, if I can ask you, the same thing.
Sure. So we undertook a survey of councillors last year on the net zero question to get a handle on their key priorities, and it's quite an interesting response. It's the usual things that you'd expect in terms of air and ground source heat pumps that they want to see in applications, PV cells, renewable energy, EV charging points. But insulation and building materials came up as one of the top answers for the key sustainable elements, low carbon elements that councils are looking for in applications coming forward. So they are a lot savvier, a lot more clued up on this than they ever have been before. So it's become a fundamental part of the housing and planning process, and that's coming forward. So we'll be seeing a lot more of it, and councillors and residents expect it. And that's linked with sustainable transport, as Paul said. I think a lot of areas certainly on urban fringes, you're looking at sustainable transport connections, cycling, walking provision and enhancement, biodiversity net gain. But it's also looking at some more innovative connections and the possibility of using car sharing and carpooling. It's been very successful. It was a bit of a fringe activity a few years ago, but especially in urban areas, it's really picking up and is helping drive down car ownership in some of the areas where you have low traffic neighborhoods. So I think there's a real success story there and something that developers can learn from. I think what all of this shows us, Rob, is that lots of people have views on these things and that they want to feed into it, and that there are more modern ways of getting the thoughts of the community on how to shape applications. So rather than having conversations in dusty village halls, which still has its place in some applications, I think that there is more that we can be doing, especially to engage with young people online on views on low carbon futures and transport methods and how they want to see these new neighbourhoods take shape.
Mute. There we go. Unmuted myself. There we go. Thanks very much. No. Right, finally unmuted. Thanks very much for that, Daniel. Technology gets me every time. Okay, well, we're running ahead with ourselves this morning. Don't know where time is flowing, but time to end with a final question for everyone. Now, just imagine, I know this is very exciting, I'm trying to sort of get too excited by it, but imagine you have 30 seconds with Michael Gove, and you have, or even 10 seconds with Michael Gove. Don't want to get too excited with that one. But imagine you got 10 seconds with Michael Gove and you have one thing to say to him. What would it be? Robbie, if I can come to you first.
Yes, Rob, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. I would say to Michael Gove, please bring forward a straightforward one-clause amendment to the Levelling Up Regeneration Bill to allow major housing NSIPs in certain cases where the local authority or government agree.
Okay, a good point. Paul, if I can come to you, you have 10 seconds with Michael Gove.
I think I'll probably tell him that it's his round. I think I would just say to him, don't let the NIMBYs grind you down. You know, a lot of what they're doing on planning reform, they have the right instincts. And I think it's an example of where they may have to take some the government may have to take some short-term political gain to do the right things for the country as a whole in the long run.
Excellent. Yep. Thanks very much for that, Paul. Snigdha, if I can ask you the same thing. 10 seconds with Michael Gove. What do you say?
Thank simplicity and uniformity.
Simplicity and uniformity. That's very concise and very good. Daniel, if I can end with you, what would you say? 10 seconds with Michael Gove.
I would say make all district elections every 4 years, not every 3 out of 4 years, and introduce a system whereby garden communities and large applications can be taken through some sort of NSIP-like scheme.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for that, Daniel. Now, I can't leave without mentioning a thought from Martin Puddle, who says that linking land use and transport is essential. In the theory, the NPPF should be the mechanism to deliver this, but needs to be more radical to ensure that local authorities and parish councils cannot block development to satisfy local politics. What is more critical is affordability, which is at crisis point in the southeast. Using the national significant infrastructure process could be the way forward to mobilise change and force the issue which authorities and some developers currently pay lip service to. So, good point from Martin. And I think the phrase that's sticking out as me from Paul there was, don't let the NIMBYs grind you down, which is very similar to a phrase I grew up with in Teesside, but I'll not go any further than that. So basically, it just remains for me to say a huge thank you to all our partners today. well, to BECG, our strategic partners, for helping putting this webinar together, and our panelists, Snigdha Jain, Paul Smith, Robbie Owen, and Daniel Fritt, for what's been another enjoyable and insightful morning. And we'll try to have a report on today's webinar up on our website later today. We're back here at 11 a.m. on Friday, 27th of June for another webinar, where we'll have another top lineup looking at how construction gets its message across to both policymakers and the outside world alike. But for now, thanks for joining us this morning. And I'm told that today is National Fish and Chip Day. And that's obviously hugely exciting. And so no prizes for guessing where I'm going now. But I wish you all a fantastic weekend. And I hope the sun shines wherever you are. So thank you very much. And I'll see you soon. Bye. Bye for now.
Thank you, Rob.
Thanks,
Okay.
Rob. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks all.